Hello, we're glad everybody could join us. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you could join us. This panel is on writing for Mormon youth, reflections on creating LDS characters for a national market. And I want to start by sharing a little bit from the pitch that we submitted. And then we're going to ask questions with some time at the end for a Q&A. So in a 2015 post for the School Library Journal, Sam Taylor writes about her childhood longing to find, quote, non-preachy books about characters who were Mormon, going to school and living life with their friends. Books that she wanted to find in the library, but which did not exist. As an adult writing in 2015, she notes that while there are many LDS kidlit authors publishing with national presses, most write fantasy and science fiction. That lack, she suggests, quote, seems to perpetuate the idea that Mormon characters do not belong in mainstream fiction, that our experiences and stories have no place outside Mormon audiences, or, as I encountered in my university creative writing classes, that Mormon representation is at best accepted if the writer is questioning the Mormon faith, tearing it down outright, or using our faith as the butt of a joke. And nearly 10 years later, that has changed a little bit. All of us have published books with LDS characters for national market presses. But we want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of doing that, some of the rewards of doing that. And the first question that I want to ask is just tell us a little about yourself and the books you've written that include LDS or Mormon characters.
Looks like Amanda's ready to start.
I have a bunch of flies in my house because it's summer in California. So when you see me going like this, it's because they're congregating. But hi, I'm Amanda Rawson Hill. I'm the author of several books, but my two books that have LDS characters are The Hope of Elephants, which is about a girl dealing with her father's cancer diagnosis and her possible genetic mutation. And this one has very obvious LDS representation, like that they're members of the church, they go to church. She talks about all of that. This one, Once Upon a Family, is my most recent novel that came out, and there is a side character, a neighbor, who her family's LDS. It's a big family, 6 kids. This one's a little more subtle. If you don't know very much, you might not realize it, but they are. So those are my 2 books with LDS representation.
I'll go ahead and jump in. My name is Cindy Baldwin, and I have 4 middle grade books out with HarperCollins and a chapter book coming out in November with HarperCollins as well. I think all of my books at this point at least mention religion or churches, but my book that specifically has LDS characters is called No Matter the Distance. This book is about a girl with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease that I also have. And it's about her both experiencing a health setback and getting through that while also developing a magical friendship with a lost dolphin in the creek in her backyard. And this is, I would say, this is definitely, the LDS characters in this are going to be obvious to anyone with a Mormon background and probably not stand out to somebody without one. It's not ever explicitly mentioned what religion they are. There are moments where it talks about going to church, and it uses verbiage like sacrament and sister so-and-so. And there's one of the plot threads has to do with the idea of impossible things that happen. And so there's some talk about miracles and what that looks like. So it's kind of like intended to be sort of a, in joke is the wrong phrasing, but it's meant to be something that's not hidden, but it's not a central focus of the book. It doesn't have a ton to do with the plot. And so it's something that a lot of people are probably not going to pick up on.
All right, and I am Elaine Vickers, and I will begin by saying I read The Hope of Elephants when it first came out and loved it. I can't hold it up because I read No Matter the Distance on audio just last week. I finished it. And just anyway, big fan of everybody's work here. My books are kind of range from picture book to middle grade to young adult. And yeah, it's not necessarily overt mention of Mormonism in any case, I don't think. My first book, Like Magic, takes place in Salt Lake City. And there's a picture of the Salt Lake Library in the beginning. And yeah, so there is a character who is Mormon, but I don't know that anyone would really know. And then my second novel, Paper Chains, kind of the same situation. I get into it just a little bit more in my young adult novels, which are published under the name E.B. Vickers, just because they're a little bit more mature. We don't want people necessarily going straight from this to that. But in my book, my first young adult novel, Fade Away, there is a character who struggles with addiction, and there are some scenes where he is in a religious setting, and there are a couple of poems with the word savior in the title. There's a scene with a big candy jar in a bishop's office that sort of would seem to lend itself to Mormonism. And then probably the most religious content is in my second young adult novel that just came out in December called Where There's Smoke. I was actually talking about this, the idea of this panel on a walk with my 17-year-old this morning. And we were talking about the religion in the book. And she said, well, if you know, you know, you know? And I was like, yep, that's what it is. So there is a bishop in here who plays a prominent role. The main character's father is a former bishop. She's kind of grappling with her own relationship with God and with those people in her life. And her best friend gets his mission call in the course of the book. So the church is never named in this book. And that was a deliberate decision because it's not an entirely positive portrait of certain aspects of the culture. And then the very first trade review we got was from Kirkus, and they did just go ahead and name the church in the review. And I was like, well, that's out there. I mean, it's not going to be a giant secret when Utah's in my bio. And there's a lot of churchiness in the book. People would probably connect those dots. But yeah, that's kind of what I've got. I don't have any church content in my picture books, except I actually just got, I'll show you the FedEx package landed on my doorstep this morning of the next F&G of my picture book that's coming out in January, which is very exciting. And I'm not sure if this is in here. Oh, okay, it is. So this is the first time I've ever been asked to write an author's note for a picture book. And my editor at Simon & Schuster asked me, would you write an author's note that just tells us where the story came from? Because I had told her as she was going into her pitch meeting. And so there is an author's note at the back that kind of tells where this story came from. And where it came from is, I don't name the church, but when I was 23 years old, I was called to be a primary president. I didn't have any kids in like a family ward. It was wild, and I felt vastly underqualified. And so what I did was I drove up Parley's Canyon to my aunt's house because my aunt had been a primary president. She knew everything. She was amazing. She was wonderful. And she gave me all of her best ideas and sharing times and all of her best material, and just kind of handed me this giant folder. And in there was an idea for what she had called secret service, for kids to go out and do kind things and leave little hearts behind, which turned into a picture book. So there is mention of church actually in this picture book that's coming in January. Mine was the longest. I'll stop talking.
And I'm technically moderating, but I am going to talk a little bit on the panel too, because this is also part of my expertise. So my book Beyond the Mapped Stars came out in 2021, and this one is very explicitly LDS. The main character is born in a rural LDS community. She's in the 1870s. She wants to be an astronomer, but she's trying to figure out how to reconcile what her family expects of her, which is to, marry, have children, have a traditional life. And she wants to study the stars, which doesn't have any practical application. She gets an opportunity to go to Denver right around the 1878 eclipse, and it kind of challenges her in a lot of different ways. And one of the ongoing themes in the book is between faith and science. Can you believe in God and also be a scientist, which was a big discussion that was happening in the 1870s in the US in any case. And so for her religion is very definitely on the page. There are scenes of women giving blessings. So yeah, it's pretty explicitly Mormon. And I think probably my favorite thing about this was that it showed up on the Bank Street Children's Book List under the diversity tag, like that they were recognizing that the Mormon identity was part of what this book was contributing, which I was really chuffed about that. All right, our next question is, why did you decide to include LDS characters in your books?
I guess I'll go first we'll just keep going in order or whatever. So for this one, when I first wrote it, I can't remember if she was LDS in the first draft or not. Cindy can tell me, she read it. I'm sure she remembers 8 years ago.
I'm pretty sure I remember like
Okay.
stuff from the beginning.
Okay, so what happened is it was very subtle, only a couple references to it in my first draft. And then I sent it off to my agent and she read it and she was like, look, this is about a family dealing with cancer and the dad possibly dying. She's like, you have a couple references to religion in here. She's like, but I think you need to bring that out a lot more. Like, it's organic, it makes sense. If this is really part of their life, she's going to be thinking about it. And so that just sort of snowballed into becoming a very important theme in the book altogether. Her father, everyone has a duality they're struggling with, and her father is struggling with his faith. He's in the middle of a faith crisis in the book. And so that one happened just because when you're dealing with life and death, religion often comes up, it's just very much a part of it for many people. So if I'm going to write about someone really thinking about religion in the context of their life, I'm going to talk about what I know. And so I did that one. As far as why there's LDS representation in Once Upon a Family, so I originally had the side characters weren't LDS, but I had to think of a reason, like, why does she feel like people are judging her? Why does she feel like people look down on her family? And so that kind of just got added in there as far as her brothers and sisters are crazy and they're such a big family and everyone thinks we're crazy. So that kind of got added in because I needed a little more motivation for this character. And it worked well because having 6 kids in a family is a very Mormon thing. So there's my reason.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I feel like the answer to this question actually kind of starts with an answer to a different question, which is when I was writing my first book, which is called Where the Watermelons Grow, which came out in 2018. This book is all of my books are set in various regions in North Carolina because that's where I grew up and I love writing about it. And this book is set specifically in rural eastern North Carolina in what's called the Coastal Plains region, which is basically as far toward the coast as you can get without actually being on the Outer Banks. And it's a very rural, very like low population density farming community area. And as I was writing that book, like I knew that religion was going to be a big part of it because in the South in general, and especially in rural communities in the South, the church is sort of the heart of your community experience. And so I sort of made the intentional decision to make my characters religious. There's several scenes that take place in church. There's a lot of talk about like the church ladies and how they're involved in community support. And a lot of the relationships that they have with other characters are through church. And then the one family in the neighborhood who doesn't go to church is like, everybody's like, oh, they're a little weird. They don't go to church. Can we really trust them? Because that is so much the vibe that I grew up with, having grown up in the South in the 90s in the Bible Belt. And so that was something that I really approached very intentionally with that book. And at the time I thought, about how the things that I was depicting in this book were different than my own religious experience growing up as somebody who was in this Bible Belt culture, but who was growing up in the LDS church. But for probably obvious reasons, that was not an artistic or stylistic choice that made sense for that character. But it was sort of always in the back of my mind. And like I mentioned, all of my books at least mention churches as settings, because churches are a huge part of life in the South. Like whether you are religious or not, you are going to end up in churches. You're going to have like different events inside churches. You're going to know everybody who goes to church. You're going to hear a lot about other people's religion and what it means to them. And so it's something that's kind of been a part of each of my books. And with No Matter the Distance, part of it is that I was writing a book that was by far my most personal book yet, because it was about cystic fibrosis. And so as I sat down to write this book, I decided, maybe this character is going to be LDS. And like I said, it's not a huge part of the story and it's not a huge part of her character. But it is something that, because it was such a personal story to me, and because I felt like, as I developed the theme and the idea of having experiences that seem impossible, I felt like I had a lot of sort of like cultural Mormon idea and conversation to draw. And I feel like we talk a lot in our culture about, things that seem impossible but happen, about kind of the recognizing the miraculous in every day. And because this is a book that is literally about a girl who has a telepathic communication with a dolphin, and also a girl who her mom always says, you are my impossible thing, because she had all of these health and fertility issues. It felt like something that was a really natural fit. So that's kind of where that came in for me. It also this is something that I feel like probably only people with cystic fibrosis, and really probably a very small minority, even of those, would notice. But one of the religion mentions in the book is that Penny, the main character, wears a mask at church, and that she's done that for a long time, even before the pandemic. And that's something that I started wearing masks at church in probably 2014, because bless our hearts, we as a community are not good at not going to church sick. And with cystic fibrosis, when I get a cold, it turns into pneumonia. And so I was being frequently hospitalized because of exposures at church. And so that was like, I feel like that experience was a defining experience of my later 20s and of my young motherhood, was that I was going to church every week and I was wearing masks, and I would get kids pointing and staring in the hallway and, asking their parents about me and stuff. And so that was another little kind of personal thing that, that I could give to Penny. This is a really weird experience that now a lot more people have had after the COVID pandemic. I think most people have experienced going to church in a mask at least once, but that was, that's one of the ways that when you have a disease like cystic fibrosis, church is experienced a little differently. And that's one of the things I could kind of allude to in that book.
A tiny aside is that, Cindy, my son is currently serving a mission in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he's in Greenville, and he's been in Kinston. So anyway, yeah, just reading your latest through that lens.
It was the mission that I was in growing up.
Oh,
because I grew up
I
in
love it. it's fun to have that like extra context for it. I love it so much. Yeah, I think if I think about that question, the initial question of how did you decide? I don't know if I did. I don't know if it was like a conscious decision at any point. Um, I just started writing characters and that was kind of what happened. Um, and I don't know if it's because my characters were coming from a personal place or because I'm a little bit lazy. But, but that was just kind of how these characters developed in my mind and on the page. Um, but once they were there, have found that like as I send things to my editor, I feel a little protective of it. And I don't want to be asked to remove it. I don't want to be asked to pull back. And I have been lucky in that there's only been I've never been asked to really remove anything except in one instance where it was totally the right call, and there was just like this character who had not had any religious affiliation, and out of nowhere there was anyway. It was weird. It needed to come out, but beyond that, I've been, I think, really fortunate in that all of the editors I've worked with across different age groups and publishing houses have been really supportive of characters experiencing religion and faith, and both in positive and in kind of curious or questioning ways. So that's been lucky.
I've had a pretty similar experience with my editors being really supportive. In the case of Beyond the Mapped Stars, my editor for this book was in fact Jewish. And so we had a lot of really interesting conversations about religion when I was writing it. For me, this one, sorry, my blurred screen is taking it out. It started with me thinking about what's a story that's uniquely mine to tell. And so because it started from that point, of course, it was going to be about an LDS character. And in fact, when I was brainstorming it, I couldn't decide where to set it because there's lots of rural towns in Utah in 1870s. And I knew that where I set it, I was going to have to do research, to get the setting right. And so maybe it was a little bit lazy. I went back in my family history. I found a young woman who was 18 in 1878. And her name was Elizabeth Bertelson. And that became the name of my main character. And I borrowed a lot of her family structure for the story. So if you read the story, she has a mother who's very faithful. Her father has just taken a second wife who is the same age as his first wife, which kind of defeats the whole, marrying younger women to have more children because she wasn't going to be having more children. And so there was a lot of tension in the family because of that. The mom had threatened to go get a divorce. But her father also had left the church because of the law of consecration that they were trying to live, that the bishop had asked him for something that he didn't feel like the bishop had a right to ask, and he got mad and he left. And so a lot of those very personal family stories ended up finding their way into the book. And I think the main character is also grappling with some things that I've grappled with, more than 100 years later, like, can you balance a career with a family? How do you keep your faith in an environment that's not always supportive of that? What do you do when you run across challenging information? In the book, she meets Jane Manning James on a train, and they have a really interesting discussion about what does it mean to be Black and LDS in the 1870s. And so for me, like, that was always going to have to, I couldn't tell the story I was trying to tell unless she was LDS. Although I will say the first draft of this book was very different. It was much more adventure heavy. At one point, I thought it was going to have a little bit of magical realism in it. And I was going to put in, like the 3-day fights or the mysterious woman in white who sometimes shows up to save people. And I still remember talking to Trisha Levenseller about this at one point, and I mentioned the 3 Nephites, and she was like, please don't do that. And I think we're all really glad that those all got stripped out of the story. My next question has to do with, we've all kind of touched on this a little bit, but when you're writing about LDS characters for a national market, you have to be really deliberate about some of the choices that you make because it's not a culture that's going to be familiar to everybody. And so this next question is, how do you approach religious representation in a book that's written for a national audience? What details do you leave in? What did you decide to leave out?
That's a good question. I think for me, My book was already running long. So I think a lot of times as storytellers and as members of the church, I had to decide what features are actually going to push the narrative along, what features are actually going to help with my theme and with what my character is going through. And it was also important to me, as far as going back to the quote that you talked about in the beginning, it felt important to me to show a story with someone who was faithful and wasn't having issues with the church, just because you hardly ever got to see that. And so for me, I wanted it just to be a positive representation that wasn't, it's not there to challenge the faith. It's just there to show it as just a normal part of someone's life and of their thoughts as they're dealing with this. And so as I decided what to keep in, I kind of just followed where my characters' thoughts were. And I also had to follow what would happen in this situation. So if you can't go to church, you get sacrament brought into you. You have the Relief Society bringing in casseroles when you get really bad news. She goes to Young Women's and things like that. And so what I chose to include was just when I was putting myself in her shoes, what are going to be sort of the standout landmark things. And then I also put in a few personal things, like I put in a reference to the General Conference talk, but if not, from like 15 years ago, because it's one of my favorites. And so I made it like her dad's favorite. And so for me, I chose to just include what moved the story along and what I felt was not going to be made fun of and anything like that. So that's where I made my decision.
I love that. For me, like I mentioned, I've had kind of religion play varying roles in all of my books. And when I was writing Where the Watermelons Grow, and I decided to make like religion and the religious community a pretty big part of it, I was honestly really nervous because I feel like even more so than now, at the point that I was writing this, which was in 2015, there wasn't a lot of like overt mentions of any kind of religion in children's literature. It was just sort of like, it was the thing that everybody just sort of like skated by and pretended that it didn't exist. But like I said, having grown up where I grew up, in the community and the family that I grew up in, like it felt inauthentic and ridiculous to write a story that was completely divorced from religion, because that was so much of how I and everybody that I knew experienced community and connection. And because that book is very much about a girl and a family who are in a difficult situation and coming to realize over the course of the story that their community is there to support them and that they can turn to their community. I felt like that needed, one of the places that needed to show up was in church, and the way that church was providing a community for them. And I feel like that has been true of most of my books. I think a lot of my religious references center around this idea of community and how church communities connect us to other people. And then there's also kind of like a few other things in my third book, The Stars of Whistling Ridge, which is about people who are fallen stars, where fallen stars become women that then can tend to the magic that undergirds the world. And there's a scene where the main characters go to church with one of the fallen stars. And so I have a little bit in there about how like church, how Aunt Agatha says that church is just another way to connect with the interconnectedness of the world, which is sort of the whole theme of the story, is that everybody is connected. We're all connected to the universe, and the choices that we make affect other people. And so so that was kind of how I put that in there. And then in No Matter the Distance, like I mentioned, I kind of brought in this thing, this idea of like miracles and impossible things. And I also brought in kind of the idea that church for Penny, as she's in a really turbulent time where she's really sick, she's missing out on a lot of things in her life, church attendance is something that represents normalcy and safety and community for her. And that's definitely something that I feel like is a factor in my life. And I think for a lot of people, like one of the reasons that church is meaningful to me is because it's something that it shapes the rhythm of my life and the rhythm of my week. And it's sort of like feels like a reset in my week. And so that's kind of the vibe I feel like in No Matter the Distance. None of my books have huge amounts of religion in them, but I have generally tried to focus on sort of like I have specific details that are specific to different faiths, but I've tried to focus on the universal experience because I think that like regardless of where anybody in adulthood ends up, the majority of people in the United States have grown up in a religious background. And so the majority of people have experienced what it is like to be a part of a religious community, whether that was a positive or a negative experience, and what it is like to even occasionally attend some kind of religious service, you know, talk to one of the older women in the church who is in every faith community and always keeping a pulse on absolutely everything that's happening, you know. And so those are the kind of things that I've tried to draw out to kind of bring that sense of like, this is a universal human experience. And even though our universal human experiences may wear different faces and they may have different, like we may say sacrament instead of communion, and we may say sister or brother, you know, that these are relationships and these are community connections and experiences that most people are familiar with.
Okay, Cindy, as you were talking, as long as we're talking about national market books with LDS representation, has anybody read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy?
I haven't yet because the whole book just sounded so stressful, but it is on my list.
It's super stressful, but super fascinating. And yeah, there is definitely a large section of the book. She's no longer LDS, but where it's exactly what you described in a totally different scenario, but like life is so tumultuous and unpredictable and unstable. And church is just this refuge where you can feel safe and you know what to expect for a couple of hours. Anyway, that was that just brought that to mind for me. As far as how I decide what to leave in and what to take out, I draft it whatever I think along the lines of what has already been said, of what feels true to the character, what feels like it's going to move the story forward, what supports the themes that I'm trying to bring forward in the book. And then the thing that I'll add, I guess, is that I really rely on other readers who are not of our faith to say, this is a little much, or this doesn't make sense, or I don't know what these words mean that you think I know what they mean. So that has been just huge and helpful. And of course, as with any critique, you take it and you decide what's right for the story. But that's been huge to me, to have other voices saying like, this really resonated with me, or this didn't make sense, or this just isn't quite working as it is right now. So that's been really an important part of the process of getting it right in terms of what the story needs, but also what is going to be accessible to the larger market and help them feel that connection in spite of maybe this character having a different religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in addition to like all of the things that you guys have described, yes, you know, what the character would notice, what kind of lens the character is seeing. It also was about trying to recreate a historical moment, which added kind of an additional layer. So for me, it took a lot of research. You know, doing a lot of research, one of the church historians very generously agreed to read a draft for me, just to make sure that some of the details were right. I also, like Elaine said, had people who are not of our faith read it and say, yes, this makes sense. No, this does not make sense. But I think those readers are a really important part of that. For me, the biggest challenge, though, was realizing how much of our language falls back on cliches. when we talk about our encounter with the divine, we tend to use the same language. And it became really clear to me early on that that language, the burning bosom or whatever, was not going to make sense out of a specific cultural context. So trying to figure out how to describe that sense of connection with divine in a way that felt universal rather than specific was something that I found really personally challenging. My next question is about communities and monoliths. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about we need diverse books, which I think is a really important movement. But part of that movement has also been stressing that no community is a monolith, right? That every community is going to have differences even within the community. And I think, as writers who are taking on ourselves the responsibility of portraying an important part of our communities, how do you address that spectrum in your books? And it might be that you don't, because you don't have enough characters, but I am curious, like, when you're writing these depictions, are you thinking about that? About like, I don't want to feed into stereotypes. I don't want, anyway, I'm curious about your process with that.
Just a really quick answer, just because I'm a white straight lady. So all I really did in mine is I tried to make sure that her church community had diversity in it, that there were people of color in her young women's group. Her best friend, who's also in her ward, is Black, and I allowed her best friend to kind of voice like, oh, we need to get more color into the young women. Like, I'm glad that this new girl is here because she brings some color. And that's really, I mean, mostly for me, as far as not having a monolith, that's probably as far as it goes for me. I was pretty standard, I guess.
So I feel like this is something that I don't really directly address specifically in No Matter the Distance, because it's about a family in North Carolina who are LDS, but the strong implication is that nobody else in their immediate community is, because that was certainly, I mean, we drove half an hour to get to my church building. Like, I was at least half an hour away from the majority of friends in my ward. And so it's not, and the references are brief enough that it doesn't, like, you literally only get a passing reference to one other LDS character who's giving a talk. So that's not really something that I address, but I do feel like in general, I have tried to be very intentional across the general body of my work to represent characters who are all interacting differently with religion. There are characters who are religious and like attending church is part of their routine and they talk about God or they say prayers. And then there are characters who aren't religious, but for instance, in my second book, there's well, actually, no, I'd forgotten this because I've been away. In my second book, there's actually characters who the implication is sort of that they're ex-religious, that they used to go to church, and then the main character's dad died and they have not gone back to church because it's too painful. But they end up in a church at the end for a music competition. And so I've tried to show kind of that there's a wide spectrum, that, like I said before, that the majority of people in our country have at least grown up interacting with religion and religious communities in the vast majority of regions, but that there's a lot of different ways that people interact with religion, from people who are like, I am in the pews every week and I am, devout, and this is a huge part of the fabric of my life, to, oh, I used to go to church, or I sometimes go to church for a community event. Or, I believe in God, but I have no external religious community or worship experience. Because I think that's again, like, having grown up both in an LDS community where religion is obviously very, very paramount. And I, like, one thing I've learned as an adult is that Mormons are particularly invested in religious worship and in religious community. But also having grown up in a place where the culture was itself so religious, that's something that I've really tried as I create new characters and as I create books. I have asked myself in every book, how is this character interacting with religion? What is their relationship to religion? And how can I show that in a way that feels authentic both to their character and authentic to kind of the diversity and the breadth of religious experience in the US?
So there's that famous TED talk, right? The danger of a single story. And I think any individual character that you write is going to be a single story from a single perspective with, of course, as Amanda said, these secondary characters that come in and kind of give it more depth, but I'm using my hands a lot right now. um, but yeah, I think any main character that you write can be a data point that hopefully contributes in some way to painting this fuller picture of what Mormonism is. I guess my book that speaks to this the most is probably Where There's Smoke, because of what Amanda talked about, where there's the main character who is experiencing religion in one way, but then other characters who are providing through another lens, and just the way that she interprets them. This book also has, I live in Southern Utah, where we have lots of opportunity to interact with members of the FLDS community. And that was kind of important for me to show, I guess, in terms of any religion not being a monolith. There's a connection between our church and theirs, probably. But there is also a really strong propensity of the characters in the book to want to see themselves as righteous, and anything less than desirable, or anything monstrous is one of the words that I use in the book, as other and distinct. And there's something unpleasant happening in the community, and they really want to pin it on that other community. And so that was important to me, to like get us to turn our focus inward rather than just othering anything that we don't like or don't want to deal with. So that was one case where I think I did it a little bit more intentionally, kind of showing different facets of what that could look like.
And it really is a beautiful book. I think you did that really well. For mine, because she starts out so enmeshed in an LDS community, this was really important to me. So the way she approaches the faith is different from the way her mother approaches it, which is different from her brother, which is different from her father's approach. And then even as she expands into a broader community, she meets Mariah Mitchell, who was a Quaker, that her perspective on religion gets challenged and expanded in those ways too. For me, this was a really important question, which is part of the reason I wanted to ask it, because I do think if you're going to write about LDS characters, especially if you're representing to a national market, this is a responsibility that we have as writers to make sure that we're showing. Sometimes it's tempting to show like just the good things. And so I'm glad that like all of you in different ways have challenged some of that a little bit, but I also think it's important that we're not just showing the bad. And so I think finding that balance can be tricky. I have two more questions that I'm hoping we can ask before turning it over to the Q&A. One is just, how have readers responded to your LDS characters, if you've gotten specific responses? And then the second, this was on my list, but William is also asking it, what kinds of LDS or general religious stories would we like to see published in the market? So let's start with how have readers reacted, and then we'll talk a little bit about what would you like to see in the market to come.
So I'll try to be fast. I was very concerned about putting this out because as far as I knew, in the traditionally published middle grade market, this would be the first like explicitly very Mormon book on the national market, written by a member. And so I was very concerned about how communities who are not friendly towards our religion would respond. I actually made my publisher take out the name of the church from their marketing because they specifically have marketed it to Christian audiences. And then in there, they said she's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. And I sent him an email. I was like, you might want to take that out because there are a lot of people who will read that and like, it will not be a marketing thing to your Christian audience. And so, but I haven't received, as far as I know, any negative pushback as far as people being upset about that. I have seen a few reviews where people are like, there was a little bit too much religion in this book for me. And a few people questioning, like, I don't think any 12-year-old's that devout, which I'm like, you didn't meet me. a 12-year-old. But for the most part, I have been very pleased that people from all sorts of different faith backgrounds have actually really appreciated the amount of faith and religion that I put into the book, and have specifically mentioned it as great representation and something that they've appreciated from other Christian religions to my Jewish friends and Muslim friends have all talked about how much they appreciated that. And so reader feedback has actually been much better than I anticipated. So that's good.
I forgot it was my turn. So I have generally not heard a ton. I did have several people who were LDS who read No Matter the Distance and either reached out or mentioned in reviews like how much they appreciated those kind of nods to that cultural part of Penny's story. I think the only pushback I've seen kind of a couple of like Goodreads reviews floating around specifically for my first book, Where the Watermelons Grow, that mentioned not liking that there was a lot to do with the church. But not like I mentioned, I was really worried about pushback when I wrote that one, and I really have not. I really mostly experienced very respectful responses, even from people who are not religious or somewhat anti-religious. So I've appreciated that. As for what I'd love to see, I would love to just, I have really appreciated kind of the increase in the diversity of religious depictions in the last decade, and I would love to see that continue. One thing that I think we've touched on here is that until the last couple years, there really have not been any books in the national market that touched on kind of LDS faith or the wider Mormon community that did not do it in a fairly negative way. And I think that that's like, I will be fully transparent and say, as somebody who has had a lot of like religious trauma and a lot of difficulty in religious spaces, I appreciate those stories, but I think that's also not the only story. And I really appreciate that there are books like the ones that we've written. I especially, Rosalyn's Beyond the Map Stars is one of my all-time favorite depictions of religion, because I think that you do such an amazing job of showing all the different facets, all the different ways that there's so many different ways that people can come to and interact with religion. Another one that I want to shout out, two other books. I absolutely, one of my other all-time favorite depictions of religious characters is called Heretics Anonymous by Katie. I'm like completely blanking on her last name.
Katie Henry.
Katie Henry. Okay, thank you.
She was
Yeah.
one of my readers for Beyond the Map Stars.
Yeah, she is great, and she grew up Catholic and also has had kind of a complicated relationship with religion, but also specifically wanted to write books that showed that having a complicated relationship with religion didn't mean that you necessarily cut religion out of your life entirely. And I love that there are people grappling with that. The other author I wanted to shout out is, I don't think I've ever, until I read Amanda's book and Rosalyn's book, I don't think I've ever read anything that resonated so much with my experiences as a religious teenager as reading S.K. Ali's books. She's a Muslim writer, and she has several books. I think my favorite one was called Love from A to Z. And she writes about devout Muslim teenagers. And I exchanged several messages with her afterwards saying, like, I have literally never read anything that resonated so much with my experience, because there's so many cultural similarities that I had never seen depicted in books, much less in a fairly positive way. So wanted to shout those out, and I would love to see more of that. And Amanda, did you want to add something else as well?
Sorry, I didn't answer the second question, so I just wanted it to come back to me afterwards. What I wanted to say is, in the future, I really want to see more LDS representation in future sci-fi. Like, what is it going to look like in the future? I really liked reading in Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, how like his mom had been LDS, and so I was like, oh, and so it's made me think about things. So I I would love to see just religion in general a lot more in futuristic sci-fi, to see like, how does it change? What does it do? When I've seen it depicted, I've loved all of it, whether it was the ending of Neil Shusterman's Saied series or whatever. So that's what I would like to see.
Real quick, have you read or seen any of The Expanse? There are Mormons in it, and it is one of the weirdest but most entertaining depictions I've ever seen. And it is futuristic space sci-fi. There is a spaceship with the Angel Moroni on it. That's my brief.
Okay, that's fascinating. I love it. I'll be quick. I have had a pretty generally positive response to Mormon characters in my books. As far as what has actually reached me, I don't know how many readers out there are like, too much church here, and just setting the book aside or something. But as far as what's actually gotten back to me, the response has been really positive, which is nice. As far as what I would like to see, I didn't really have an answer to this until I was answering an earlier question, and mentioned my son. I would love to see, and I don't know how you do it, to be honest. I would love to see a main character who is a missionary. I feel like in the broader culture, the idea of what a missionary is maybe comes from the Kids That Knock on Your Door, but also the Book of Mormon musical, which, full disclosure, I haven't seen. But I would love to humanize missionaries, partly for my own kid, as like, this is a kid who's away from home and trying to figure out the world and trying to figure out his own relationship with God and just doing his best. So be nice to him, and just kind of humanize that, and just see them as real people, who are certainly imperfect and sometimes a little overzealous maybe, but I think that would be really fascinating. And I don't know how you do it and still make it really broadly appealing to the national market audience. But there's got to be a better way to do it than the musical, perhaps.
Agreed. Have any of you seen that there's a trailer for a A24 horror movie coming out with Hugh Grant in a couple of months that is about sister missionaries? And
No.
so it may or may not be a good portrayal of religion, but it was super fascinating to watch the trailer and see how many things I felt like really got right about kind of the visual depiction of sister missionaries. And both of the actors grew up Mormon and are former Mormons. And one of them specifically said, as soon as she heard about this role, she was like, I have to get that, specifically because she said she wanted to honor her family of origin and the community that she had grown up in, and wanted it to not be like a one note portrayal. So no idea, like it could end up being a negative portrayal, but I thought it was really interesting. It was definitely, I felt like, based on the trailer, one of the most nuanced depictions I've seen so far of that. And also the other thing I've seen about it is that I was not a missionary, but I've seen women who were missionaries on all sides of the faith spectrum, all over the internet, talking about how much the idea of the movie resonated with them based on the kind of like some of the unsafe situations that they felt they got into as a missionary, and how emotionally resonant that was.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Elaine, did you want to say what kinds of books you'd like to see?
Something with a missionary main character.
Oh, that's right. You just answered
that's
that.
maybe it.
That's what we were talking about. That it's funny because I was actually thinking about that just walking up to my office before this. So I was a sister missionary, and unusually enough, so was my mother, and so was her mother. So I thought it would be like an interesting contrast someday, like an interesting contrast just between what the three of us experienced in very different eras, as sister missionaries. But that's way out there. As far as reactions, I've been really moved by some of the reactions, and granted, most of them are from LDS readers. But when people reach out and say, this is the book I wish I'd had when I was a teenager, or I read this and then I bought copies for all of my nieces. Not that nephews can't read it either, but But some of the stuff she struggles with is specific to being a young woman in a religious community. And that's been really gratifying. As far as what I would like to see, I think I just would like to see more, and I would like to see it like the books that you guys have written, where it's just part of the character. It's not the story arc. I feel like one of the challenges facing religious characters is it depends a little bit on the faith. I feel like if you are a progressive Christian, there's a easy place for you in the national market. If you're coming from a more conservative religious background, it's harder to write about unless you're writing about the process of leaving the faith. And so I would love to see just more of a spectrum where that's not a thing you have to challenge necessarily. It's just a thing that's there and it's part of the community. But I also, Cindy, Katie Henry, I love Heretics Anonymous, but she also has a book with an LDS main character, and I'm spacing on it. It has something to do with like the end of the world.
Let's call it a doomsday.
Yes.
I actually
Let's
did
call it a doomsday. And I thought she did a fantastic job writing a really sensitive character. And so I would like to see that more of LDS writers writing LDS characters, but also if other people are going to write our faith, that they get it right. And I think we have maybe just a couple of minutes. William says we can go over a couple of minutes if there are any. So if there are any questions from the audience that we haven't addressed, maybe we can take just a couple minutes and answer those.
While we're waiting on that, Rosalyn, I have a request. Would you read to us your dedication for Beyond the Map Stars? Because I love that so much.
Okay.
You're muted.
The first part where I dedicate it to my husband is probably not the part you meant. To the skeptical believers and believing skeptics, there's room for us too. And I guess that might also be something that I want to see is space for people who are not 100% in, no question, and 100% out or on their way out, because I think a lot of us exist sometimes in that middle space. Elaine, it looks like there's a question for you.
Yes. Okay. How have Mormons reacted to where there's smoke, which can be seen as critical of Mormons? I generally don't read reviews on Goodreads. I read trade reviews that come in, but I don't read just reader reviews, Amazon, Goodreads, that kind of thing. So I'm guessing there is some criticism and maybe some genuine hurt out there, because it definitely isn't a 100% positive portrayal. But nothing critical has reached my ears. I don't know whether, for example, my bishop has read it, but but there are members of my stake presidency who have and are just like supportive, and this is good job, you. So that's been really I don't know, rewarding is maybe the wrong word, but I'm glad that we can look at things with a little bit more critical lens sometime. And that was, as I mentioned before, one of the goals of the book is let's turn this focus inward, and like, Lord, is it I kind of a question. There are terrible things happening in the world, and in what ways am I both implicitly and explicitly contributing to that, and what can I do to do better? So yeah, to more directly answer the question, I haven't had any direct criticism come to me. I haven't had anybody report to me directly or indirectly that they were upset or offended. So I'm really encouraged by that maybe we're willing to see ourselves in that way as imperfect, but hopefully moving in the right direction. And the more we look inward, the more I think we can move in the right direction.
There's one last question, which is, can you talk about what you're working on next, whether it has Mormon tie-ins or not?
So I am trying to break into nonfiction, so I'm always writing science stuff about that. I'm right now working on a middle grade book about a bunch of child criminals. One of them's a llama, and they're trying to break out of this child prison, because the middle grade market is in flux and I'm trying to write something that people will want to buy. And then the other one I'm working on is a verse novel about a girl whose mother has died, and she is traveling to other universes to try to find a version of her that will work. And what I'm exploring in that one is specifically, I wanted to explore Christian ideas and spirituality from a specifically secular viewpoint. And so I actually have them quoting scripture in just a little bit of a secular way here in the future. So like when they release her mother's ashes out of the space station, they say like, we stardust thou art, and unto stardust thou shalt return, or whatever. So that's what I'm working on.
I'm kind of in a weird moment where I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on, and I'm not sure what is going to move forward next. None of the projects that I'm working on right now have Mormon characters, in large part because of the story and the region where they take place. It's just not something that really makes sense for those stories. But it is something that I would like to explore again in the future.
I am kind of bouncing back and forth, as is often the case for me, between a middle grade project and a young adult project. The middle grade project has sold and is about a kid playing baseball. That's never been done before, right? And the young adult project is about a teenage pilot. And neither one of them at this point really have much religion at all in them. I'm trying to think if there's any. Not really right now.
I am currently in the process of revising another Regency. This one would be leaning more adult. And then I have a couple of back burner projects. One would be an adult, probably paranormal, but set at on a university campus in Utah. So I don't think the main character is LDS, but there would definitely be supporting characters. And then I also have a YA that I'm not sure what I'm doing with. That's a retelling of a contemporary retelling of Austin's Northanger Abbey. And one of the side characters in that one is definitely LDS. And then we have one last question that we can hopefully answer quickly. Do you have a sense whether your portrayals of LDS characters are read mostly by Mormon or non-Mormon readers? And I'm just going to answer that one for Beyond the Map Stars. I honestly am not sure. I mean, I've gotten responses from non-LDS readers. I had a friend who assigned his college class to read it. So I know that there was a lot of non-LDS readers in that one. I think because a lot of my circles are LDS, the comments that get directly back to me tend to be more from LDS readers. So I don't have a great sense of that.
The sense I get is it's more non-LDS readers for mine. But I have found that my LDS readers really appreciate it. And I think that's part of why it won the Whitney.
I also don't really have a sense, and none of my books, I think, unlike both Amanda's and Rosalyn's, none of my books have been marketed as like having anything really to do with religion. I would say just statistically, I think my books are mostly being read by non-LDS audiences. But like I mentioned, I have had several people who are LDS reach out to say how much they appreciated that. So I feel like I'm hearing mostly from readers who have Mormon backgrounds, but it's probably mostly being read by readers who do not.
Yeah, I would mostly just echo what Cindy just said. Fade Away was on several state lists, and I've never been on a state list in Utah, but just kind of across the country. So I would imagine that most of especially the teenagers who are reading it, are not LDS, is my guess. But yeah, lots of feedback from LDS readers.
And for everybody listening, thank you so much for joining us and for asking great questions. And thank you, Amanda and Cindy and Elaine, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Rosalyn.
so
Thanks, everybody.
together.